In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the physiology of mastication and deglutition. So I'm sure you're wondering what those words mean, mastication, deglutition. So mastication, it's the Latin word, it comes from the Latin word to chew, and mastication involves the process of food preparation, including moving unchewed food to the surfaces of the tooth and chewing it and mixing it with saliva. And then deglutition, this means to go down, which means, or to gulp down, and deglutition refers to swallowing. So here's a definition of deglutition. It's the semi-automatic motor action of the muscles of the respiratory and gastrointestinal tracts to propel food from the oral cavity to the stomach. Okay, so mastication and deglutition, these both involve really extreme coordination between the muscles and independent systems. And so both processes develop and mature from infancy to adulthood. So how we swallow as an infant is different than how we swallow in adulthood. So these processes involve integration of lingual, velar, pharyngeal, and facial muscle movement with laryngeal adjustments and respiratory control. Okay, deglutition. When we swallow, it has to be safe, adequate, and enjoyable. Let's think about that. So when you swallow, it has to be safe, adequate, and enjoyable. The reason why we are spending time talking about swallowing is because as a speech pathologist, we work with people who have swallowing problems. And so all of the muscles that are involved for speech are also the same ones involved for swallowing. And when you have a swallowing problem, it is one of the scariest things that we do as a speech pathologist is working with people with swallowing disorders because of how serious it can be. So that's why we need to make sure that swallowing is safe and adequate and enjoyable for people. Because I know that, I don't know about you, but I really love to eat. Okay, so let's look at how we swallow as an infant. So our nervous system and muscles develop, allowing an infant to stabilize their head and their neck and their trunk, because we know that babies don't come out. They come out very floppy, and they're not able to hold up their head and neck and trunk. So at first, it's infant reflexes that allow feeding to take place. And actually, swallowing begins prenatally, which helps the gastrointestinal tract start to develop. Okay, so let's look at the infant structures compared to the adult structures. So here's the structure of a child and an adult. Well, not even a child, but an infant. Let's look at the difference. What do you see is the difference between these structures and these structures? You should notice that the infant oral cavity in here, is smaller. Also take a look at the laryngeal structures. So do you see the laryngeal structures here and the laryngeal structures here? Do you see how higher up the laryngeal structures are positioned in a child and then they drop in adulthood? Also, look at the size of the velum relative to the pharynx. So do you see the velum here, back of the pharynx, and the velum here? You see how it goes straight across in an infant structure. So at birth, the larynx is elevated, but it descends over the first 4 years of life. So the hyoid is elevated and forward in an infant, and then we can see that it drops. The whole laryngeal structure drops. So this larger velum and an elevated laryngeal structure plays an important role in an infant swallow. Also, another really obvious difference is that there is no dentition in an infant structure. We see that they don't have teeth yet. Okay, so infants are primarily governed by reflexes, and so infant swallowing is going to be a reflex. There's the rooting reflex, and this reflex is if you touch a baby on their cheek near their mouth, you run something along their cheek, they're going to turn to the source of it, thinking that it's food. There's also the sucking reflex, and that sucking reflex, if you put something in their mouth, if you put a nipple or a finger, they're going to start to pump their mandible and their tongue to suck. One of the most important things about infant feeding is that swallowing and respiration occur simultaneously. The baby can breathe and swallow at the same time, whereas an adult, you have a period of time where you stop breathing when you swallow pretty quickly, and then your respiration system starts again. But in an infant, these two systems are happening simultaneously. So around 6 months of age, the teeth start emerging, and the significance of when the dentition starts emerging is that the teeth block the anterior protrusion of the tongue and helps with retraction of the tongue during swallow. So I want you guys to take a look at your textbook and read the information in there about infant swallowing for more detail. Now we're going to talk about a mature swallow. So what does it actually look like when an adult swallows? So mature deglutition develops, and we can break up mastication and deglutition into 4 phases. So let me back up and say mature deglutition develops in the first year of life. And then the adult sequence are broken up into these 4 stages: oral preparatory phase, oral phase, pharyngeal phase, and esophageal phase. So we're going to talk about each one of these separately. Okay, the oral preparatory phase. This is where food is being prepared for swallow during this phase. So there's a lot of coordination that goes on here. So first, food goes into the mouth. So think about putting a cracker into your mouth, and you start chewing. So you put it into your mouth and you keep it there by closing your lips, and you're breathing through your nose, and your tongue is bunching up in the back. And so you start chewing. The soft palate, your velum, is pulled down to keep food in the oral cavity, so you don't want it going down into your nasal cavity. The food must be ground up using muscles of mastication and your lingual muscles. So as you're preparing this food, this is called bolus preparation. So a bolus is a small clump of food that you've prepared, and so it's just chewed up food. So you're chewing this food, you're pushing it onto your teeth, you're preparing it into a ball. The tongue helps keep the food in the oral cavity. The tongue is moving the food onto the surface of the teeth for grinding, and then it pulls the food back into the oral cavity to mix with saliva. So typically in this oral preparatory phase, you are chewing between 15 to 30 times before swallowing. So I want you guys to do something, and I want you over the next day, when you eat something, I want you to count how many times you chew something before you swallow. And I want you to see if you think if it's in between that 15 to 30 times before swallowing. So in this oral preparatory phase, you're chewing food, you're preparing it to be swallowed. The amount of time is kind of variable, but like I said, it's between 15 and 30 times. This is a voluntary stage. You are voluntarily chewing your food, and the airway is open. You're still breathing here. Okay, so the oral preparatory phase, you're chewing your food and you're getting it prepared to swallow. So the major muscles involved in this are the facial muscles, the jaw muscles, the mandibular muscles, the tongue muscles, and the soft palate muscles. Now the second phase, this is called the oral phase. So during the oral phase, this is where the bolus is moved to the back of the mouth. So there's transport of the bolus to the back of the oral cavity. So during mastication, the tongue base is elevated at the back, but during this stage it drops down and pulls back. So in the oral phase, mastication stops, so the chewing stops, and the anterior tongue lifts up to the hard palate and squeezes the bolus back toward the facial pillars. So this typically takes about 1 second. Regardless of the texture, you should be able to take the bolus, lift it up with the front of your tongue, and squeeze it along your hard palate, pushing it to the back of your mouth to the facial pillars. The facial pillars are those arches in the back of your mouth when you open. So when the bolus comes into contact with the facial pillars, the soft palate and the posterior tongue base triggers a reflex, and that starts the next phase, the pharyngeal phase. Okay, so during this phase, this is voluntary because we're voluntarily moving the food to the back of our mouth, and we are still breathing in this phase. The airway is open. So let me just recap. In the oral phase, you stop chewing. You already have formed a small ball of food, and you're taking that ball of food and you're taking your tongue and you're pushing it to the back of your mouth. Once it reaches the back of your mouth, it's going to hit your facial pillars and start the next phase, the pharyngeal phase of swallowing. So the major muscles involved in the oral phase are the mandibular muscles and the tongue muscles.